This is the position between International Master Andrew Brown with a FIDE rating of 2261 versus International Master Moulthun with a FIDE rating of 2417 in the recent Australian Open Round 5 game 2013. Moulthun with the black pieces has just castled kingside. You are white in this position. What would you play? So let's see how Moulthun replies after bishop f3. Bishop b4. Again a developing move, and again a pin. This time the bishop on b4 pins the knight on c3 to the king on e1. And at the moment the knight on c3 is completely unprotected, so the piece is on pre, and white immediately has to do something about this knight, otherwise they're going to lose a piece. Moves the spring to line, bishop d2, same idea as before, bishop e2, or possibly bishop b2 might even be playable. The other point I see here is that black also has pressure on this c4 square with two attackers. So I think bishop d2 is probably a bit more accurate here, even though I would prefer to have my bishop on b2. It's not so good, I don't think, on b2 without a knight on e5. So with a knight being exchanged, it doesn't make quite as much sense to put this bishop on d2. The other thing is we have to worry about is that black does have the move knight e4, and the good thing about bishop d2 is that if this is ever played, you can always play knight takes e4 yourself and attack that bishop on b4, which is a nice little cheapie to always have up your sleeve. Andrew decides that in this position he's going to play bishop d2, breaking the pin on the king. And so far from what I've seen of these moves, they're just sensible moves. They're not aiming for too much. They're just meeting the threats patiently and just attempting to build a position. White's an extra tempo up, and you would say that white has about the same amount of space as black. You know, equal, no real advantage for either player. Black to play. Black moves the knight from b8 to d7. Where else was the knight going to move to? It was always going to go to d7. As another tip for anyone who's a novice out there, that if you know that your opponent has to develop the knights and bishops, and you can see that there are pieces or pawns already on the squares with those pieces again, then it should be no surprise to you that the knight's going to go to d7. I mean, if it can't go to c6 because there's a pawn here, can't go to a6, there's a pawn there, it's just natural it's going to go to d7. You know, it's not rocket science, this stuff. How will white play? White decides to castle. Again, a sensible move. King safety, get the king into safety before moving the rooks. And now he's almost fully developed. He's almost got the queen off the back row, and black's almost fully developed as well. Black castles. Now, interestingly, I'm going to have to go back a little bit now because I actually failed to notice this, but after castling, white's actually set a small trap, which I didn't notice. In this position, before white castles, knight takes d5. It doesn't work because black always has the intermezzo bishop takes d2 check. But after white castles, bishop takes d2 is no longer check. So there is always the possibility of the captured knight takes d5 being played. And you'll notice that when the knight goes to d5, that if the black bishop captures on d2, you can play check with knight takes f6. So knight takes d5 is a threat in this position. It doesn't look like it's a threat, but it is a threat. And the reason why it is a threat is because the bishop on b4 is unprotected. Unprotected pieces often leave your position open for time gaining maneuvers against them. So let's see how this panned out. It turned out that the seemingly completely normal move, king castling for Moulthun, is actually a serious error. And the reason it's an error is because of tactics on the d5 square. And Recidian just switched straight away to knight takes d5, with c takes d5 being the second line. Now that the d5 square becomes critical. Here's where you can learn from computers in that you have to try and figure out why suddenly the d5 squares become such a big thing. And here it's obvious that the reason why the d5 squares going to be a big issue in this game is because this bishop on b4 is going to be attacked by the bishop on d2 and the knight on d5. So let's look and see what Andrew plays. Knight takes d5. It's a great move. Nothing wrong with it. Now there's an attack on the bishop. What's the bishop going to do? Well, the first thing to note is you can't take with the c pawn. You take with the c pawn, bishop d2 takes b4, and you'll be down a pawn for not much compensation. The reason you're down a pawn is because the knight took a pawn on d5, and then when the bishop takes on b4, it's hitting the rook. So that gains another tempo. So white's attack's just flowing now. The pieces got developed onto good squares, and now the attacks are gaining time as they're moving. So white has a clear advantage there. And the same thing would go for the e-pawn, because exactly the same sort of variations. The move that we need to examine in more detail are the forced captures by black. Bishop takes d2 and knight takes d5. Let's look at knight takes d5 first. Actually, I'll correct that. Let's look at bishop takes d2 first. If bishop takes d2, what are we expecting white to play? Well, I'm expecting white to play knight f6, check, and then bishop queen takes d2. And I'm pretty sure that'll show it to be a clear advantage to white because you've just won a pawn with tempo. How would we classify this? Well, what I would say is that once a discovered attack turned up on d5, the white always had a jumping off space that was going to be a check. So it was always going to be pretty safe, this tactic. And you can see that knight at f6 is just winning. Knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes bishop d2, and you're just a clear pawn up. Good position. You've got a great bishop attacking, great bishop on f3 attacking the c6 square. No problems for black in this position. I'd expect white, lots of problems for black, no problems for white. I expect white to gain the full point here. In the game, knight takes d5 was played. And this at least looks tricky because you're protecting the bishop on b4. But let's try and figure out before it's played why it would be an issue. So if the knight goes to d5, white has two choices of where they can capture. They can capture on b4 with a bishop d2 to b4. Or, so black's played this, so black plays knight takes d5. Or they can capture with a c pawn on d5, or even the bishop here. And often when you're looking at and analysing these things, you should look at the moves that give choices, and you'll notice that if they capture on d5, the move c takes d5 actually gains more choices again, because after you've played c takes d5, the bishop is still on prey on b4, and now you have a pawn on prey on c6, which if you capture will be an attack on the knight on d7. So these sort of little opportunities to keep on gaining time and stuff like that are what actually keep the initiative and keep the flow going in the game. So here it is, knight takes d5. Black decides they're going to capture this. Knight takes d5. And white, unsurprisingly, captures with the pawn, because this move's going to gain time. They don't make the mistake of taking on b4. That would be like a beginner's mistake, because like a beginner's mistake here would be bishop takes b4, and you'll just see the position turn straight away to black's advantage, because the knight's been able to capture and at the same time save itself, defend itself from the attack, even though it is only a slight advantage for, believe it or not, for white, even though black's won the piece, because the knight even on b4 it's trapped. There's no actual square it can go to immediately. So it's going to be problematic for black to free it anyway. You know, if they protect it with queen e7, you can just play presumably something like a3. Worst case scenario.